run-of-the-mill like white dude who walks into a seminar room and he sits down and there's literally nothing in his head. Like there's nothing going on in his head because he doesn't have to think about, wait, how am I like, is my hair okay? Like, am I sitting up straight? Okay, I need to make sure to say at least 2 things at the beginning of seminar. Otherwise the professor's gonna think that I'm like a mute Asian girl.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second ever episode of IAC Unfiltered, which is our unofficial podcast name for our Inter-Asian Council series. We are so excited to be diving into, our topic for today with Dr. Yumi Kim, who is a professor at Johns Hopkins, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about women's health in the Asian Pacific Islander Desi American community, among many other things that we'll dive into in this conversation. So thank you so much, Dr. Kim, for being open to having a conversation with us, and we'd love to get an introduction about who you are and your research.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join. I am, as you said, Alicia, a assistant professor of Japanese history in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins. I have been at Hopkins now for about 5 years, and my research is focused on the history of medicine, histories of healing and care, focused on East Asia, mostly Japan, but a little bit in Korea as well, South Korea. And specifically, the research that I'm working on now, it is really focused on questions of how family and especially women both experienced and also cared for those who were considered mentally ill in the late 19th century and early 20th century in Japan. Although the project started as a kind of inquiry into, well, what happened when Western derived psychiatry entered Japan, I've kind of left those questions behind and become more and more interested in the kind of labor, caregiving labor performed by women, the ways in which family relationships, but also ideas about family shaped women's experiences of their own mental, emotional, spiritual afflictions. And I continue to be interested in various cultures of care and healing within an East Asian context.
Yeah, I definitely can already see how some of these ideas that you've sparked even bring up personal experiences that I could talk about within caregiving within my own family. And I'm curious as kind of a question of what, I guess about the research that you have been exploring with this, first interested you, if there's anything related to your background that made you really want to talk about these topics.
Yeah, there's always sort of these questions when I give talks or I talk about my research where someone really wants to ask, oh, is there a kind of case or experience of mental illness or caregiving for someone who is mentally ill that has informed my project? And there wasn't, at least initially. But what really got me interested in the topic was that I did not necessarily buy into the idea that mental illnesses are universally uniform and that they're experienced in the same ways across societies, across communities. And as a historian, I'm less interested in theorizing about, what is mental illness. That's not quite my field. That's what psychiatrists and others do. And what I'm more interested in as a historian is how understandings and practices of caring for those who are considered mentally ill, and then also sort of, tracing kind of ways in which people have even defined or understood what it means to be mentally ill. Those are the kinds of questions that have interested me. In terms of there is a kind of very specific personal, I guess a kind of, I guess a personal reason for some of the research that motivated some of the research, which is that I have always been very kind of annoyed and puzzled by the way in which women in general, but especially within Korean and Japanese societies today, and in the past, the way in which women are described as being moody. And so there are parts of my work that address that question, and I try to delve a little deeper into that. So that is one kind of element of my research that is motivated by some pretty personal questions and experiences.
Yeah, Dr. Kim, when you listed out the phrase that you just said about characterizing like women as being moody, I feel like, you know, my guard just got up. I was just like, you know, thinking of all the comebacks that I would say back to someone if they had like described me as moody, or like, yeah, just the stereotype that is associated with that. I'm curious as to, you know, kind of diving deeper into the, I don't know, associations that you feel like, because we were talking about before, like this culture of like care and caregiving and like, you know, being emotional, like as women or in tune with, you know, our emotions, I guess plays into some of the stereotypes that are being given to, I guess, APIDA women nowadays, or maybe back in history.
Yeah, you know, so it's always, I mean, I do want to, there's a way in which this kind of general stereotype about women, it takes on a specific quality within uh, Asian societies. And now I'm not really talking historically, but more in terms of my own sort of personal experiences. And uh, but this is not something, I mean, I should say that's not just specific to, I think, Asian and Asian American women, or this kind of stereotype that's directed at Asian and Asian American women. But it comes from, I mean, just hundreds of years of gendering and sort of seeing emotions in a way that is feminized, you know, but that hasn't always been the case. But it that sort of crystallized, at least in, I mean, in Japanese society, there's a long history of it. And the late 19th century was a moment in which that became actually a very useful way to describe women. And there are a lot of different reasons for it. It's because, you know, there were new medicines and sort of pharmaceuticals that, you know, could be marketed towards women and characterizing women as emotional and kind of, you know, having these sorts of affective disorders that could help sell medicine, for example. So this is never, it's never an inherent thing, you know? So there's that. But, you know, I think also there are ways in which, you know, our families, our relatives, you know, I'd like to hear like what some of you hear within your own communities, whether it's your family or your friends, like how are the Asian women described? Like either yourself or the women around you, or what are your own stereotypes?
I think at least within my family, I have a few female cousins who are all older than me, so they're all like 26, 28. And whenever I talk with them through WeChat, which is like what we use for video conferencing, I always hear in the background of their parents asking, I guess my older cousins, why aren't you married yet? Where are your boyfriends? Why can't you start a family, have a kid, and so we can have our grandchildren? So I feel like there's always this continued and persistent expectation for women to start a family and rely on their, I guess, male or like their spouse to make it earning and for women to take care of like the domestic items within the family, which I think is very prohibitive for women who want to start their own career and achieve like their own goals in life. And definitely like speaking in terms of my own experience, I know my older cousin who's currently started studying pharmaceuticals and working within like a pharmaceutical company. She really just wanted to pursue like her own career within the medical and the science field. But I know like her parents is always pressuring her to go on like blind dates and like really just to get that marriage stamp, which I think is so traditional and conservative in terms of like like it reflects the traditional values of Chinese culture, but at the same time, like the limits that it places on women within Chinese culture.
Yeah. Jen, I might have to resonate a lot with what you just stated because I feel like maybe a phrase I would use is just like restricted, like liberation of feminism in a way because for background, like, you know, I identify as being Chinese American and my like speaking I guess to the intergenerational relationship with my like mother and my mom's mom who are like both college educated. It's just interesting the like expectations that they place around me, like being their only daughter in the family, which is heavily like reliant on, you know, very like similar things like being professionally driven and like the value of education that they've placed on me and knowing its importance, but also at the same time not pushing myself like too far, I guess, beyond the limits of what is expected for a woman. Like, you know, I should go to like become college educated, but when I had a conversation with them when I was like first entering into Johns Hopkins, they were like, oh Alicia, instead of, and I was pre-med at the time, oh Alicia, like instead of becoming a doctor, why don't you become a nurse instead? Like these very gendered professions that I think that they had like natural associations with because that's what they, you know, they assumed that like me being, you know, wanting to have a more like relaxed career where I balance, you know, having a family or marriage, like going into something that's less like, I don't know, conventionally like rigorous, such as being a nurse. And so that on top of, like Jen was saying, some of the expectations that have been placed around me to get married or start a family have been pretty strong, I would say. It's just very funny, like the pressures that I guess that are placed on like Asian women, like depending on how like your family is raised, because my mom like had like very ingrained attitudes of, you know, the steps that one needed to take, I guess, to, you know, be a woman and then start their own family. So it's just something that they passed on to me. And they'll always like funnily nag me or, you know, ask me questions about like if I am ready for marriage or, you know, when I'm going to start thinking about those sorts of things. Like, when do I want to start a family? And yeah, I can see like in my own like manifestation of my life how I want to like challenge those attitudes with them in different conversations.
That's actually so interesting to hear because you know, both of you are talking about a kind of, there's like this kind of family based but also broader sort of social regulation of women's life stages, essentially, right? That you do this, like when you're in up until when you're in high school and maybe college, you're expected to study really hard and become as highly educated as possible. But then after that, you know, you're right to point out that many women, not all, in my case, my family put no pressure on me in terms of marriage. That didn't mean that I didn't feel it, right? Because it's much bigger than just our families. But yeah, there is this kind of regulatory aspect. Societies are really concerned about making sure that women follow particular kinds of paths, right? And so, you know, even in Japanese society today, like the first time I ever lived in Japan and I started making Japanese friends who were women, these were all women who were attending elite colleges, like cream of the crop. Like they were so smart. They were getting jobs at, you know, I mean, they were getting some of the best jobs out there, which in Japan, as is the case in other East Asian countries, it's usually a public sort of like working for the government type job. And the minute they got those jobs, they were then expected to have babies and start families and leave those jobs. And there was just, you know, I remember thinking at the time, wow, must be really confusing and stressful for the women. But interestingly, since then, I have become, so since that time, which was like maybe 10 years ago, I have gotten married myself and had children. And I just had a baby actually like 6 months ago, which is part of the reason I was saying we might get interrupted. But now that I'm in the position of, I'm in the position of trying to grow my career, have a family, it makes me realize that, a lot of it is about pressure from our families, but it's also, I have maybe not shockingly, maybe it's not surprising at all, but like I've internalized so much of that, and it's always kind of startling to think, if feminism was supposed to give me a choice, right? Like I could do this or that, or I could try to do, all of the above. It has made me realize that there's sort of something missing in the equation, because somewhere in between, right? Like trying to regulate women's lives and let women be totally free, so to speak. Most people's lives are somewhere in the middle. Like mine, it just feels like somewhere in the middle. And I love that you brought up marriage, because this is one of the sort of, and men obviously are affected by, the pressures to marry as well, but this is a particularly kind of fraught issue for young Asian women or women of Asian descent. And it really goes to show what I see over and over again in my own historical research, which is that a lot of women who suffer from various mental, emotional, and spiritual afflictions, so much of what they experience is understood by them, by the women themselves, through the category of family and through ideas about family. Like, for example, not being able to marry, right? Leading to what we today would call depression, or concerns about one's sort of reproductive abilities being pathologized, right? Like the idea that like, oh, if I'm not able to, or if I don't give birth, that somehow becomes a kind of mental illness. These were discourses that existed in the late 19th and early 20th century, and actually even today a little bit. So it's really fascinating to hear that, for both of you, like marriage is that kind of, it's like that axis around which so many ideas about women turn.
Yeah, Dr. Kim, and this brings up a really interesting point that when I took this course called Born a Girl, Seeing Health Through a Woman's Lens, some of the ways that I feel like women's health, like the definition of women's health becomes manifested is that it is I don't know, very directly tied to, I guess, a woman's ability to reproduce, or their just their childbirthing abilities, because women's health initiatives, when you oftentimes look at them, revolve around contraception or menopause or pregnancy and childbirth and their sexual health. And there were very few times in the research that I had done where it was tied to, I guess, other things relating to I don't know, thing not related to childbirth, if that makes sense. So I feel like there has been a natural association that society has tied from women's well-being and worth to, what they produce in terms of their, children and future generations.
Yeah, it's there's this sort of it's sort of a paradox that you're absolutely right that when we think about women's health and whether that's specific to the APIDA community or more broadly speaking, there is definitely a focus on kind of reproductive sort of capacities, for lack of a better term. And yet at the same time, when you enter that world, and I'm really only talking from a personal perspective because I'm not a practicing physician, it's amazing how much women are left in the dark about what is happening to their bodies when they are trying to conceive, or when they have conceived, or whatever stage you happen to be at, or when you're, not interested at all. There's just, it was sort of stunning to me, the extent to which women are also assumed to not be smart enough to understand if they were to receive an explanation about what might be going on. But then also generally, that something else that I felt very strongly was how much of women's, like, the very experience that is supposed to, like, that stereotypically makes women women, which I mean, I completely disagree with, but the way that it has been framed, broadly speaking, for instance, like, if we choose childbirth, like, the very thing that is supposed to be like the thing that women do is also made into something shameful and very secret, actually. Like, you don't, and people don't, and women are not necessarily, a lot of women don't feel free to talk about childbirth or what they experience. And when those conversations do happen, it's almost always only with other women. So one thing that I think is sort of the key to, and this really stems from my historical research, because I see it in my historical research as well, is that women were so important to one another, because, and I think continue to be so to this day, because public domains of knowledge, so to speak, or institutions, they're not very helpful when it comes to really being able to take care of women's, and even when we're just talking about like reproductive labor, right? Like there's that kind of support you really only find in communities of other women. So there is, that's, and that's, it's a positive thing, but it does mean that women, within Asian communities need to go seek that out. And many don't realize that it's there.
John, Michael, feel free to like jump into the conversation if be. I have other things I wanted to ask, but
I definitely agree with like the importance of the social ties to women's health, especially considering the fact that when they're placed in the context of the family, there aren't that many people that I can talk to, considering the intergeneration gap between maybe your mother-in-law or your father-in-law. Certainly, like, these are people that you may not necessarily talk to about your own sexual or mental health. And then there's also the role of women as the caregiver within the family setting, because men aren't necessarily expected to take care of everything that's domestically related, and women are expected to take care of children, at least stereotypically. And with parents who are growing older, women, especially in their adulthood, are also expected to take care of the aging parents from both families, their parents-in-law and their biological parents. So I'm wondering, like, how has the stereotypical view for women to be the sole domestic caretaker, as well as like to work within a professional setting, affected like the mental health and the ability for women to really grow their own potential?
That's a great question, and it's such an important question. And I am not equipped to answer it in a sociological way, because I haven't done that research. I can actually only really give you a sense of my personal experience. Is that something that would be of interest? I don't know if you want to hear that angle. But yeah, so again, this is not just Asian communities. This is, communities across the board. The huge assumption is that women in the family will be the primary providers of care, and not just care because someone is ill, but as you were saying, John, care for, like raising children, caregiving when it is emotional, right? And not just physical. So there's a lot of like intense sort of expectations of emotional labor that is performed by women. And I think this is a real detriment actually to the people who don't identify as women in these communities or families, because it just means that there's a kind of narrowing of a sort of field of possibilities, like when it comes, for all people involved. So that, one kind of result is that, and I'm thinking specifically about Japanese families today, although this is changing, and this is changing in Korean society as well, but fathers have a harder time bonding with their children, and it is less socially acceptable for, not just in Asian societies, it is really hard to like be a stay-at-home dad and to like have that be socially recognized as something that is valid, right? Like even harder than it is in the US or in parts of Western Europe. So it's a real loss, I think, actually, that that reproductive labor is not shared more across the board. And at the same time, it creates incredible inequities. The thing is, when I became, I would not have thought that this would happen exactly in this way, but when I became a mom, I wanted to do everything. I didn't want to miss a single moment, of, like with my firstborn, like with my son, I didn't want to miss a single, thing that he did. And, I'm not necessarily like, I would not have seen myself as like the nurturing type. So it was very shocking to me that I would feel this way. But the year he was born was the year that I graduated from a PhD program and became an assistant professor. And so, there's a lot of conversation about juggling and work-life balance and all that nonsense. It's nonsense. There's no such thing as, there's no balance. You just choose. And what happens when you're in the midst of trying to decide, am I going to do this or that today? Like, will I do this? Will I give up that? And there's very little social support, right? And there's some institutional support, but not a lot. What ends up happening is that women become very distressed and depressed. And maybe I shouldn't say women. I really just kind of, I'm talking about a very small, relatively small sample size, like me and my friends who are in similar positions. But it's hard. It's really hard. And there aren't that many venues in which to talk about what it's like to, and this is where I think it becomes really sort of more specific to Asian and Asian American women, is that not only are you dealing with your own desires to be, say, a parent, but you're also grappling, and I'm thinking particularly, like in this moment, that is 2020, you're dealing with a lot, both at work, in your sort of broader communities and at home, that really affect your mental health. I'm actually specifically thinking about racism and the ways in which I think the racism that Asian women and Asian American women experience is often not even considered racism, but it has a huge impact on Asian women's mental health. And I think that connection is rarely made, and that connection is not often understood by our families who may not be as familiar with, US, because American racism is a very particular form of racism, and who aren't familiar with that. And so they're not really able to even understand what you're talking about when you say, it's really stressful for me to go to work. one thing that, I'll give a really specific example of the way in which racism and sexism, right, intersects in my own professional life, is that, at Hopkins, it is very, well, oftentimes, people just assume that I'm a student. Yeah, and I mean, really, like, colleagues, like fellow faculty, usually white people, there's a way in which I am not, it's surprising to them, especially because I'm not on the med school campus, I'm in a humanities department, and it is really, it's interesting. I mean, to me, it's sort of fascinating because, it's kind of like, wow, I had no idea that I would become invisible in this way. That the kind of possibilities, like people's imaginations are so narrow that they can't quite fathom there being a young Asian woman faculty member. I see the surprise from students too, and usually the surprise is like a kind of positive surprise where they're really excited, actually, right? Like they're excited to see, especially my female students, they sort of come to me, and I think there's always like this sort of awkward kind of like moment of like, oh, I know you're not my sister and I know you're not my mom, but I feel a connection with you. And, I think that's great. Like, I didn't have that when I was in college. I didn't have a single, I did not have a single Asian professor, period. I mean, man or woman or other, I didn't. So all of that really affects women's, I think, mental health. And it's not really an open public conversation that we have.
Wow, Dr. Kim, I resonate with that a lot as someone who identifies as like an Asian American woman. I think particularly one of the things that was like coming to mind was just the stereotypes that I think that, are perceived as like APIDA woman, but then how I have like potentially internalized that in like different settings, especially when it comes to the professional setting, because I'm like a senior right now, like potentially going into the job market like next year. And, some of the stereotypes that I think, and I'm going to be entering into like a business setting. And so some of the, stereotypes of like being a woman and also being Asian, like definitely come to the fact that I could be meek, like mild-mannered and like obedient and not willing to like speak up. And that's all to say, like, when I'm a part of different conversations, part of me when I'm like not saying something, is starting to internalize my own stereotype threat of like, oh my gosh, if I'm not saying something, people are gonna perceive me this sort of way as like a stereotypical Asian woman. But also if I like am speaking out loud, like, and it's only for the fact that I'm trying to like defy these stereotypes, is that also like helping like with coming up with a solution? It's a really, really hard line to balance, and still some things that I have to like sort out with myself on, how do I go about like dismantling like these internalized attitudes that I have, and being okay with like if my character is more like mild-mannered or if I'm more outspoken, like, yeah, validating that as like an Asian American woman, and also, I guess still navigating these like different scenarios with people of different identities and how they might perceive, people in our community.
Yeah, it's I mean, think about what you just pointed out in terms of, like I sort of imagine I have this like, there's like this, kind of run-of-the-mill like white dude who walks into a seminar room and he sits down and there's literally nothing in his head. Like there's nothing going on in his head because he doesn't have to think about, wait, how am I like, is my hair okay? Like, am I sitting up straight? Okay, I need to make sure to say at least 2 things at the beginning of seminar. Otherwise the professor's gonna think that I'm like a mute Asian girl. So I gotta talk and it has to be interesting. And it has to be fun. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm always like, oh God, that guy's just sitting there and there's no thoughts, right? Like there's no pressure to have those sorts of thoughts. Whereas we consciously, right? Like I mean, not just Asian women really, like almost all people of color, will sit in a room and there's this thing, right, called double consciousness, where you are literally yourself, but you are also outside your body, and you're outside yourself looking at yourself, but not through your own eyes, but through the eyes of white people, right? Like, how am I going to be perceived? So there's this like constant battle. How am I going to be perceived? Wait, but this is, I think, how I actually feel. But oh no, wait, maybe this is not how I actually feel, because this is actually a stereotype. So wait a minute, like you said, should I be resisting this stereotype? I mean, come on, how can that not cause like mental and emotional and spiritual harm and confusion? And and then so when therapists or counselors or academic advisors who are not aware of these sort of deeper issues of both like histories and experiences of racism within racism and sexism within Asian American communities, they literally say to you, like, you need to be more confident, or you need to, like, you need to up your self-esteem a little. And it's like, no, it's so complex, right? Yeah, the internalization is really scary. I think it's scary the moment you realize the extent to which you have internalized some of those things, some of those, like the racism and the sexism. And I like, Alicia, how you're like, and I'm trying to work through it. And it's like, but remember, even as you try to work through it, it's not your fault, and it actually shouldn't be your responsibility to have to work through it. At least I think there's sort of a broader social responsibility for other people to give you the kind of support, so that you feel protected. But it does often feel like, oh, it's up to me. And that's why it's important that we have more people who look like me teaching courses, in humanities and social science, in the humanities and social sciences at Hopkins, because these are really the disciplines, in which we really think about things like racism and stereotypes and stigma and cultures of mental health, and because then you get people like me who understand at least a little bit what the students in the classroom might be thinking or experiencing.
Yeah, Dr. Kim, I just wanted to thank you for, I guess, the words of affirmation that you had, because I do feel like oftentimes like people of color, like we place so much like individual responsibility and like for the things that we have internalized, but really it is a product of like broader society and the racist systems and structures that we are a part of, and just trying to like, I don't know, sometimes survive like rather than thrive. And so yeah, I really appreciate the fact that we have to, as a collective, like recognize our own like privileges and powers in the broader like institutions that we're a part of that have probably made us feel this way, and holding other people accountable to, I guess, like creating better structures for those to like feel validated and comforted, not just like in an academic setting, but in all settings. So yeah, I think that, yeah, that was really, really good advice. And in terms of seeking out like culturally competent, like mental health care and people that look like you, I definitely think that is a really important thing that we in like the Asian American community and many other like communities of color think is so important. We even like in Inter-Asian Council had like a talk about the importance of media representation, like not just people who are within like close contact of you, but people who you see like when you consume, TV or music or books that, have similar like cultural identities to you, and what that means in terms of like, I don't know, making sure that your thoughts and feelings like are validated is all like really important. And glad to know that there are like professors, at the Hopkins campus that also understand the differences in like how students need to like be cared for and thought about when it comes to how they interact as students and beyond. So
Yeah, no, I mean, at the very least, I hope that, if they're, and I have a lot of Asian students, Hopkins is, the undergrad community is what, like 30 something %, right? Of Asian American or Asian descent. And I teach Japanese history. So I get a lot of Asian students, and I hope that at the very least that they're not necessarily feeling the pressure to, especially the women, I try to create environments in which they won't feel pressured to have to do anything in one particular way or another. Yeah, no, you constantly need, of course, self-reflection. And like you said, Alicia, especially reflecting on our own powers and privileges. At the same time, I've really come to understand that one of the ways in which I can exercise my power and privileges is by advocating on the behalf of Asian and Asian American students.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Sorry, John Michael, if you have like more things to say, but I definitely agree because I feel like although, Asian representation as like in its aggregate at Hopkins is really strong in terms of like representation, right? Like 30%. One really interesting thing is if you disaggregated that and like recognize the nuances in like who in the population constitutes being Asian, not just like East Asian, but also particularly like South Asian, Southeast Asian, and Pacific Islander populations. Like, what does that mean in terms of how they're feeling about their identities being represented on campus? And I feel like that speaks to the fact that sometimes Asians and Asian Americans get characterized as monoliths, right? Like we have all these similar needs and like backgrounds and experiences, but it's, we have things that are shared within the broader context of our racial identity, but in terms of like ethnicity and culture and many other things, yeah, there's a lot of things that we have to unpack and recognize. And, I'm hoping that I guess like advocating for change within being Asian American, like in my own community, but what that means in terms of the nuances of like different communities within, I guess like the Asian and Asian American diaspora as well.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think this is also this is part of the reason that the hit knowing at least a little bit of the history of even the term Asian American, right? Which is a it's a recent coining. In the late 60s, this is, and it was supposed to be a kind of political term, actually. Right now, like the term is kind of bland, right? Like Asian American, like what does it signify? Definitely not a radical political stance the way that it did when it was first coined. But you're absolutely right that the phrase, or sort of even saying Asian American, it's sort of supposed to be a catch-all. But at the same time, there is tremendous diversity, right? Even within, and you all know that. So I don't even have to go into that or try to convince you. But what I did want to say though, is that I think it goes to show that the idea of representation is very limiting. And what I mean by that is we have 30 something percent of, the Hopkins undergraduate population, identifying in some way as Asian or of Asian descent, right? In whatever form that may be. But do you all feel like you have power on campus because you make up 30 something per 31, 32, 33%? It's very different to say we are represented, like there's a lot of us, right? Like we are represented, but that doesn't necessarily equal like real power then that you have to affect change and do things and have people listen to you, right? Like have people who are, say, like the president of the university or upper administration, like, will they listen to you because you're 30 something percent? I mean, the university didn't even administer a statement about Asians being targeted, right? Early, I mean, continues to this day, but especially, in the early months of the pandemic, when there were hate crimes against Asians, there wasn't even a message, right? But it's like, but you think 33%, no, it doesn't matter. Like I've given up a little bit of hope when it comes to the kind of like liberal politics of representation. Like representation is important. I mean, I was just saying, right, that having someone who looks like you, or, the whole conversation about like, Asian actors and Asian this and Asian that, in the US, which on the one hand, it's like, yes, we need that. But then on the other hand, it's like, oh no, but that's not that. It makes other people think, or not other people, actually Asians too, probably, both within and outside the Asian community, it kind of lures you into this sort of comfort zone area of like, oh, now we have I don't know, like, oh, we have now like a show on HBO that features Asians. So we're good, There's it's deceptive. That's really not, that's not really how it works. So, I'm really glad that you all are so active on, the is it Inter-Asian Council? Because this is precisely the kind of place where you can actually think about and enact and then sort of go beyond ideas of representation and act and talk about the ways in which you can make changes so that there's actual change, right? Changes in who wields power and influence.
Yes, I definitely agree, Dr. Kim. I think about that so much, especially in terms of, representation is only it's just a really small drop in the bucket when you like obviously assess power and privilege and who holds that. Still currently, like in all of our political systems and other structures, even when we talk about like representation, for the people who can give like the casting calls for people or sign the record labels for individuals who are seen like as artists. It's definitely, when you operate in still like a racist system where we are still seen as like a model minority, there's a lot of work to be done and people to be held accountable. So I think that Inter-Asian Council, we hopefully do like want to continue working like more and like being more cognizant of all of those things, like not only within the nuances of the APIDA community, but also I guess like the broader context of what it means to strive for racial justice. Because interestingly enough, when a lot of things around COVID were happening with Asian sentiments and hate crimes, we did want to focus like a lot of our efforts on talking about BLM and Black Lives Matter and writing more resources towards addressing anti-Blackness within the APIDA community. But at the same time, there is still a lot that needs to be acknowledged, that anti-Asian discrimination and xenophobia is still really rampant nowadays. And so there's just so many lines to always draw and so many issues that we could be focusing on. So just goes to show, I guess activism is like a lifelong commitment that you would hold yourself accountable to.
Yeah, and I hope that, through the kind of activist work that you all are doing, that you'll see the connections between, anti-Asian, anti-Asianness, or rather, I should say, you'll see the connections between things like the model minority myth and anti-Blackness, right? Because the two are so intimate. I mean, they are dependent on one another. And so the real kind of, for me, the sort of object of analysis, to put it academically, for me is whiteness and white supremacy. And dismantling that really should not only fall on the shoulders of the people who are most harmed by it, but actually the people who, reproduce those powers and privileges. So, obviously, like, the work that you're doing is incredibly important. At the same time, I hope that you won't think that you are solely responsible, It's kind of going back to what you were saying, Alicia, about how individual women are made to feel responsible, or individual people of Asian descent are made to feel responsible for the kinds of things that are happening in their lives. And it's just always more complex than that.
Just one potential final question to help our viewers or listeners out. What would you say would be the best ways to sort of help address these inequalities and help alleviate them for the future in terms of representation or anything that we've talked about today?
I think the number one thing actually is for individual, and I'll focus specifically on individuals of Asian descent. I think the number one thing is to find ways to understand your self-worth. I think that's where it has to begin. It has to begin with knowing that you are valuable and that you are worth so much as a human being, and that no other metric than your own should really matter. So I think there's a lot of that kind of like internal work that has to be done, and a kind of grappling with, every individual sort of set of experiences. With that kind of self-reflection, which also usually involves talking to members in your community and your friends and your families. I think the other thing that you can do is to find ways in which whatever work or sort of project or things that you're interested in, there's always a way to there's a way to be an activist through whatever your project or passion or commitment or job might be. So I would encourage those who want to address structural inequities to not necessarily think, in order to do that, I have to be an activist, but to think about the ways in which you can do it in the very places that you find yourself, whether you're a student, whether you're working for a company, whether you're working at a school, whether you are a dad or a parent or a grandmother. I mean, there are just so many ways. I think we need to expand our the kind of our imaginations when it comes to like the different ways in which people can be activists. So I know it's a little abstract. It's not like I'm telling you to like go sign up to work in XYZ organization. I think it's so important that it starts with that internal work and then goes out from there, because that external work is not worth it if you yourself can't see your own self-worth. Because if you can't value yourself, you're never going to be able to value to the full extent the kind of equities that you're trying to create in the world.
Dr. Kim, thank you so much for those parting words. I'm sure the three of us, I can speak like on behalf of us, really, really enjoyed like being able to hear your perspective, not only in terms of talking about women's health in the APIDA community, but broadly what it means to strive for like racial equity, gender equity, like equity on all fronts. Thank you again. And for all of our IAC listeners who are still tuning in, thank you for listening to our second podcast episode with Dr. Kim. And we look forward to seeing you on the next one.
I look forward to the next one too. I'm going to listen to them. Not mine. Probably not mine, but I will listen to the others.
Good. All right, great.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks so much for doing this.